Yeah, I never heard of you before until I watched the Red Sea Crossing Part Two, where Tim interviewed
Yeah.
you, and I bought your book following from that because I've been a big fan of his films since he released the first one, and yeah, I thought what you had to say in the film was really, really interesting, and I do lean towards the supernatural approach on that Red Sea crossing miracle. So, yeah,
Yeah, I was, first of all, Tim Mahoney is just doing a fantastic job with the entire Patterns of Exodus series and really turned, I think, awareness to a whole new generation of the biblical narrative, of the evidence, and presenting, for so many years, the whole dating of the Exodus has been so um, tainted by it's kind of like and this is what I like to compare it to. I don't know if have ever heard of Dr. Semmelweis, but back in the
no,
1800s, he, I think it's Semmelweis, it's German because of the W, and he proposed germ theory. He was basically an OBGYN. And back in those days, like in the 1820s, you had such a high infant as well as mother mortality rate. So he proposed germ theories. Back in those days, they'd go do autopsies and then come deliver babies without washing their hands. So you can just imagine the cross contamination that occurred. Well, he made all the doctors in his ward wash their hands and cut down mortality rates, something like by 95%. It was just incredible. But guess what? He was demonized because he had a new theory. He had a new idea that challenged the status quo. And it was just horrible what they did to this man. He was actually beaten, things that you wouldn't even think would occur in an educated society. But it's kind of the same thing with when you challenge the status quo in, whether it's archaeology, theology, those values, those ideas are entrenched. So when you go over the Exodus may not have happened in 1250 BCE, it's a lot of discussion that goes on. But on the other side, you have the whole atheist argument where they are saying, there's no evidence for the Exodus. There is no God. The Israel's history is just bunk because there's no evidence for it. So it's kind of this catch-22. So, my scholarship, what I try to do is say, whether it's archaeology, whether it's religion, is let's kind of turn back the clock on time and let's go 2,500 years prior to where these people when they actually lived and when they wrote, what did they have around them? What were they drawing on? For instance, Isaiah draws on an incredible amount of Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian literature throughout, especially Isaiah 40 through 66. And if you're not aware of that literature, you can't really appreciate the writing as much if you don't have that knowledge. So I think, that's where the Patterns of Evidence series really comes in and brings it to life because it shows you what happened and where these people would have walked, where they would have lived, what they would have seen. So it really provides an incredible context.
yeah, absolutely. It's really grabbed me, and it motivated me to defend the narratives, and now that we can draw on physical proof as well, and yeah, look at those key questions like the dating in 1450 and Avaris below the city of Ramesses, and the Gulf of Aqaba. They didn't know that existed on maps until later tradition. So yeah, all that stuff is really fascinating, isn't it? Yeah.
It really is. Well, and I think David Roll's greatest contribution, because he is also associated with the patterns, or what used to be, I don't know that he still is, but he was associated with the Patterns of Evidence series and with Mr. Mahoney, is his contribution on Joseph.
Mm,
Um, and bringing in the context. I mean, they've known about that statute that existed. They've known about the mortuary tomb, But when you see that coat of many colors, which, that's so much different. I don't know if you grew up in a Bible believing house where you saw the stripes, and it was, oh, this rainbow coat. And then to see, oh, no. Well, archaeologically, we know from the patina and also from the pigment that's on the statue, these are the colors that it would have had, and this is what that coat of many colors would have looked like. So I really think that is a valuable contribution to the discussion, and it gives you something tangible, something you can walk away with. And Joseph had red hair. I mean, who would have thought that,
Yeah.
So I guess kind of going to you in the UK there, and where you have the Irish and, you have a lot of redheads over there. So there's kind of, some ties to heritage there.
Yeah. Oh, really fascinating. Yes. I would love to ask you, I've been doing a lot of research on end times, Israel's role in end times. I know we have lots of people have different ideas. I was really intrigued in your book when you connected covenants with prophecy. And it's probably a connection I never would have made, but it's really fascinating. But the one that got me thinking was one you said in a video that the cover with Noah promised that God would never flood the earth or destroy the earth in this way again. I suppose my question to you would be, a lot of people have end times, a lot of ideas with end times and destruction and war, but do you think that covenant says something different to that?
The specific thing that the Noahic covenant says, and that's in Genesis 9, it specifically states that God, Yahweh, which is the name of God in the Old Testament or the Tanakh, it specifically states that God would never destroy the whole entire earth via a flood. That's not to say that some worldwide destruction could not occur, but the method he would never use again would be water covering the whole face of the earth or a majority of the earth or everywhere, where there is mankind. So that was the specific promise that was given in Noah's covenant. Now, kind of lead into your question right around Genesis 9 verses 5 and 6, it does talk about a worldwide day of judgment that would occur if everyone killed his brother, like if there's a gross occurrence of murder across the face of the earth, if we're not honoring animals. That's actually, one thing that people miss is with the Noahic covenant, animals are actually included as recipients and they are granted certain rights and privileges. And one of those is that you do not ingest their blood. So their blood has to be properly disposed of if you were going to eat their meat. So that is later incorporated into Israel's law code, but it's something that's binding on all nations. So what you find, and all of Israel's prophets talk about this, is this day that is coming of judgment. It begins in Israel, and then like a fire, it spreads to the rest of the earth. So that is a worldwide judgment that's talked about. And the imagery that is used is more of fire rather than water.
Mm. Do we know if the Tanakh tells us if a day of judgment has already happened in Israel? For example, would the 70 AD Jerusalem siege be an example of that, do you think?
Actually, yes. But it began a little bit earlier. You have a lot of, so let me just back up a little bit and we'll get into what Israel's prophets call, if you read your good old KJV or some, English translation, it is going to say the day of the Lord. And throughout, the day of the Lord occurs something like, I think, 60, 70 times in the Tanakh. And, I think it's that Zechariah says it's a day of judgment, not a day of salvation. Is something that's terrifying. So with the day of the Lord, it's something that is gloomy, something that is terrible. It's horrific. And you find that this day is talked about in Israel's law, specifically what God did when he brought Israel out of Egypt at the first Exodus is he used that wilderness period to test them so that he could see what this people would do. And they rebelled against him 14 different times when they were in the wilderness. So they were on the plains of Moab. They're about ready to cross over into the promised land. And Yahweh tells Moses to write a song that would witness against Israel in a later period. This is commonly called the Song of Moses. A dear friend of mine, Patty Tyler, has a wonderful YouTube video. I encourage everyone to check it out, but it's called the Song of Moses. It's actually a very historical based song based on what we know of the original way it would have been sung. And so, but you find that in the Song of Moses, this day of Yahweh is something where it's going to be brother against brother. There's going to be sword against sword. There's going to be civil wars. There is going to be foreign invasions. It is just this time of incredible Holocaust. I think we've all seen that picture of the siege in 70 AD, where you have, the Jews being slaughtered on the altar. And that's one of the things that Josephus tells us. He says that in 70 AD, when the Romans came in and they conquered the city, that people were actually slaughtered on the exact altar there in front of the temple. He said that the streets ran with blood. It was just like inches deep with blood, that you couldn't walk anywhere because there were so many people being slaughtered. So it was very, very horrific. But this day of judgment actually begins before Titus and the siege in 70 AD. Before that, you have 63 BCE, where Pompey comes in and the temple is besieged again. But the time of judgment really begins even before that. So if you go back about another 105 years, the day of judgment, or this horrible day of Yahweh, actually begins right around 168 BCE. And the prophets tell us that it will occur not for one day, but for 2 days. And we also know from the Psalms that when you are using prophetic language or symbolism, for them, a day is not 1,000 years. It's actually, in this case, it would be 2,000 years, because the prophets say, you will be repaid double for your sins. So there's this idea of it will take 2,000 years. Hosea talks about they'll live without a king, they'll live without all these things, without a priest. And then in the third day, I will revive them and I will restore them. So you really have this very unified idea in all the prophets regarding this day of Yahweh, which would have been a day of tribulation, a day of refining, of making Israel into a new creation that's actually willing to listen to God, willing to obey. And then you have a period of later salvation. In the Torah proper, the one that was given at Mount Sinai, in Leviticus 26, you have a prophetic law. And this is a law of chronology. It goes through the time of blessings from the day of the judges through King David and Solomon, and then it goes through curses. You find there is a corollary in Deuteronomy 28 through 30, verse 10. And what happens is you have the structure of Leviticus 26 that is just kind of bare bones. And then you have Deuteronomy 28 through 30 that comes in and fills in a whole lot more detail. And so the day of Yahweh is actually acknowledged within the curses of Deuteronomy. So this is something that was established during the wilderness at Mount Sinai, and then later again in the plains of Moab by Moses, right before Israel enters into the promised land.
So there's an important history connecting the chronology, I suppose, wouldn't it, of God's people through these different periods, it seems.
Well, there is. So what you find, and you know, a lot of times when you're talking about issues of salvation, issues of judgment, one of the ideas that often comes into play is the idea of predestination. Especially, you know, if you're going into Calvinism and some of those ideas. What you find as far as Israel's history in Deuteronomy 30, Moses tells Israel, I have set before you life and death, good and evil. And then he says, he commands them, he says, choose life that you, for you and your seed. So there's this command for us to choose life. And Moses has told us that he's given us a way of living that produces life. So it's up to us to choose. But you also find that that holds for all of Israel. So Israel has the choice to choose between good and evil. That choice is always in front of her. So there is no predestination in that regard. But what is predestined is God's response to Israel's evil choices. So Israel is free to choose the good and everything is eternal. You know, there's no judgment from God. But if she chooses to do wickedly, well, God, in that testimony in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 through 30, God has already foretold, he's forewarned Israel from the very beginning, this is what I will do. And one of the things that I showed in my book is that in Leviticus 26, there's 70-year increments that these occur. In Deuteronomy 28, there's really no time period, but you're able to put a time period to it because once you anchor it to Leviticus 26. So when you go through this, you find definite time periods. 350 years is about the extent that a tabernacle or temple is allowed to be on the land. Before the gross iniquities of the people cause that tabernacle to collapse, and it's usually by a foreign invasion, that where there is some sort of war. This holds true for the tabernacle in the Judges era when the Philistines sacked it. It holds true for Solomon's temple, which existed about 350 years, and it also holds true for the Second Temple, which was actually it was really dilapidated and accosted in 168 by Epiphanes. So you find that these, and I term them cultic judgments, are very, very much recurring. But you find that this testimony sets specific times of judgment that occur, and then at the end of it, and this is, and before I go on real quick, God's judgments are predetermined. So it's not like you sin and you don't know what God is going to do. You actually know exactly what he's going to do. And when I went through the evidence for, you know, whether it was Kings and Chronicles or the prophets, you found that when the testimony mentions blight, well, here's a prophet saying, well, you put blight on our land. So it totally coincides, which is absolutely amazing. Every single Assyrian deportation was foretold in the Torah, you know, especially in the plains of Moab in Deuteronomy. Every single Babylonian deportation is actually noted. I mean, it's very, very short phrases, but it's, you know, you will have children, you will not enjoy them because they will go into the land of their enemies. Every time something like that is mentioned, that is actually prophesying to Israel of a specific deportation. And what you find, you don't find this in scripture all the way. You have to actually go to the Assyrian records, the Babylonian records, and you find records of those deportations. So it's just amazing. It's like a glove. It fits. All the evidence is there. But what is revolutionary and what is different from most lines of thinking, because in most systems, everybody's looking to this future time of judgment that's way off, you know, this horrible time of tribulation where some people see the earth being like a thermonuclear holocaust where everything's incinerated and very few people exist. It's actually the exact opposite when you go by that prophetic law in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, because what you find there is that we have been in a period of judgment for the last 2,000 years. We've been slaughtered. There's been Holocaust. I mean, look at the Spanish Inquisitions. Look at all the Inquisitions by the Church of Rome. Look at the wars between nations that have occurred, whether it's the War of the Roses or all these other horrific things, not to mention the 20th century. I mean, look at what happened between the Bolshevik Revolution, between Lenin and Stalin and Mao. Let's not forget that. That was even more horrific. Of course, Hitler. I mean, you have all of these horrific things that have occurred, but that's all in the past. What you find is in Israel's future is a time of regathering and a time of salvation. And that is something that's very, very different from most of the models that are out there and most of the ideologies that are out there.
Yes. On that note, so would you say that in the covenant promises that even after the 70 AD event for Israel, that there is the promise that they would return to their land after that event? Do you find that in the covenants?
Yes, you find that both in the covenants as well as throughout Israel's prophets. Isaiah 52 really brings this home. He's like, where is this bill of divorcement? Israel was divorced from the land, both, and let's make this clear too, because everybody really focuses on Judah. But the northern tribes, the tribes of Ephraim, are also part of this. Being deported from the land does not divorce the descendants from access to those promises. I mean, they're there whether you are aware of that heritage or not. So what you find after the 70 AD, there's this prophecy of being 2,000 years without a temple. Being repaid double for their sins. So there's this time where they're living in diaspora. There's time where they are horribly persecuted. Deuteronomy 28 talks about diseases of sore and long continuance like cancer. It talks about in the morning you will wake up and you will basically cry and shake at the sound of a falling leaf, thinking that some calamity is coming upon you. In the morning you would say, would that it was evening, and the evening would that it was morning. I mean, these are really horrific times because of the unsurety of life. For people, I mean, us living in the Western world, thankfully we cannot relate as much to those people who have went through the change of regime in communist China. The people, say, if you lived in Poland or Venezuela or some of these other very, very oppressed places of the earth, where a regime change, it's not just a succession of prime ministers or a succession of presidents. We're talking about a regime change where all of a sudden your life is turned upside down, and what was yesterday is not today. And that is really the history that has occurred in the last 2,000 years of world history. So what you find from a biblical perspective is that those times of change are supposed to come to an end, where all of a sudden righteousness and justice, Deuteronomy 30, especially verses 1 and 2, it says, you will call me to mind. You will remember me among the nations in which you are scattered. And it says, if from there you will seek me from all your heart, he says, I will restore you. And the phrase that you see throughout the Tanakh is, I will remember. And remembering for God always refers to remembering his covenants, the covenants with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the nation of Israel. And when he remembers, it's the idea that he is going to reestablish those covenants in could be in a new form, but it will not, it won't, how can I say it? It won't do away with the promises that are already written. And that was one of the things when I went through. There's about 20 covenants that were made with the patriarchs. Not one covenant ever trumped or annihilated or superseded the promises or stipulations within another covenant. They're always rolled into the next covenant.
Mm. Would it be true to say that the rebuilding of a third temple would be part of this restoring and gathering back into the land? Is that true?
It is. Now, the question is, what type of temple? Everybody looks to Ezekiel, and that is termed the third temple. But actually, Ezekiel's temple ended up being Herod's temple. When you look at Ezekiel 40, to 46, all of those parameters that are given, it's really what King Herod did. And there's a lot of things that, if an astute student, when you read it, should make you a little bit concerned, because there's these huge walls of separation between the people and God. I mean, it's like there's iron bars and partitions being put up to keep people from God, with this whole idea that their iniquities and their sins are so great, they can't have access. And Ezekiel even says, God tells Ezekiel, show this pattern to the elders of Judah and see if it doesn't make them ashamed. So that temple, I do not see being the temple that will be rebuilt. What I am, and let me take another step back. Many of the regulations surrounding the tabernacle and the later temple were very, very prophetic in nature. The wine, a lot of times you had sacrifices that had wine associated with them. Scripture uses wine as a euphemism for false doctrine. So you find that a lot of these things won't be necessary. They won't be needed. Anciently, at the time that the Torah was given, you didn't have a monetary system. You didn't have currency. Not everyone had access to gold and silver. If you were poor, you may never have seen a piece of gold or silver your entire life. So your means of wealth was actually your livestock and your produce. So what did God require at the first temple but livestock and produce to be brought to support the priesthood? In Mexico, especially in the Aztec culture, their money were actually cocoa beans, and that is how they would use for currency and how they would trade. In Israel's time, ancient Israel, you would use livestock as a form of currency. You also find that they had these little wooden pomegranates that were also used as well. So, but it has to be something that's a form of wealth. Well, today we have currency, and everyone has access to, because of the way that society is set up, which is actually very much based on a Torah model, with a very equitable system where everybody can choose their own occupation, they can choose their own career, they can pursue employment, go to better employment. All of those ideas resonate with Torah, but it allows you to become very wealthy. So I don't see where a lot of the things that you would have brought to the tabernacle or temple will be necessary in the future. I do see a temple that is perhaps more of a memorial, perhaps with a museum, maybe something that where you could start at one end of the museum and walk through all the archaeology. I mean, just something done up incredibly well, where you could see all of Israel's history, Yahweh's promises. Well, this was his judgment. Promise, if you do this, evidence that Israel did it, and here's evidence of his judgment. Something like that, where people could walk through and go, whoa, But I think there will be some sort of physical structure where he will actually dwell, because that is the ultimate promise, is that he will again dwell among us. And
yeah, that's actually really helpful to define what kind of temple, isn't it? We sort of maybe fix our idea on one model of a temple.
Yeah, well, we do. And, not everyone sees all the implements of the tabernacle and temple as means of prophecy. Like, for instance, one of the things that I show is that outside the temple, there was this huge tub of 2,000 baths, and it was filled with water for the priests to clean themselves. And other people would cleanse themselves as well. And you find that these 2,000 baths correspond with this idea of 2,000 years in diaspora. You find that the menorah, which very clearly, and I think everyone's might be a little familiar with Psalms 119, where it says, your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Well, you find in Zechariah, again, you find that the word menorah in the Hebrew is always, it always corresponds to representing the word of Yahweh. So all the implements, the showbread represented truth. You had all these things that were given to Israel so that they were means of transmitting knowledge in a world where maybe not everybody had access to quill and scroll. It was a way for them to pass that knowledge on and through tradition, and keep those ideas alive. But I don't see with all of those fulfilled, I think there's more of a memorial that is needed to it, rather than an actual practice of some of the things that went on with the first temple.
Yeah. Within your studies of the Tanakh, I'm just thinking of Israel and sort of end time connections. Do you see any evidence at all for some sort of tyrant or dictator person who would persecute the Jewish people, or would you say that is more that has already happened in history?
So it's happened multiple times in history. And it occurred in Egypt as well, even before the temple was destroyed. And because it's really odd to me how ignorant, I know I was so ignorant of the intertestament period, from right there from Cyrus, king of Persia, all the way through the Romans. It's like there's this huge black hole of information where it's like, okay, what went on here? Is it even important? You find it's very, very consequential. So you find that Philopator, one of the Ptolemies in Egypt, he actually deported a lot of the Jews. It was, like 250,000 Jews. He made slaves of them. They were persecuted in a very Nazi style, put them all in a hyperdome, was going to kill them. They were actually in like this concentration camp where there were fences and people could walk by them. And this was a good 120 years before the temple was just, I'm sorry, it was like maybe, it was a good 120 years before the temple was destroyed. But you find there have been these pogroms against Jews for hundreds of years, thousands of years. And again, Christians have been caught up in this as well. So this isn't just Jews, because many Christians are indeed descendants of Israel, whether they know it or not. And you find that this persecution has affected them as well. The Roman Church would call them heretics. If you had science where maybe the earth does not, maybe the earth revolves around the sun rather than around the earth, that evidence and challenging the status quo within the church was something that you could be burned at the stake for. So Jews and Christians have both been affected during this day of judgment. You find that it could happen again, but what I am seeing throughout the scripture, especially when you look at Isaiah 52, is that all these times of oppression, scripture talks about this time when Israel would awake, and this time where Yahweh would awake and return. And what I am seeing in the people that I deal with and the people that I talk to, there is this awakening of truth, of returning to, some people call it the the faith of Abraham, the Abrahamic faith. And I cannot tell you the hundreds of people that I am coming to on a yearly basis where they are awakening and they're saying, oh, they're reading the Bible for themselves rather than allowing a pastor to read it for them or a rabbi to read it for them. And they're going, there's a lot of good stuff in here. And they're really kind of returning to their heart and their origins. So as far as something that could occur in the future, it could. But for me, it always comes down to a righteous God. If people are turning from wickedness, if they are seeking God, if they are seeking truth, then God would not be righteous to allow another calamity to occur when we have the right heart, we have the right spirit, and we are seeking him. If he's a righteous God, then he will save and deliver.
Yes. And sorry, this might be a tricky question to answer, but when we hear terminology like Israel's deliverance or the regathering to the land, what does that physically look like? I know that's a tricky question. Does it mean the turn of the heart to God anywhere in the world, or is this a physical description in the land of Israel?
It's both. So in Isaiah 52, you find that Israel becomes circumcised to God in both heart, spirit. She becomes clean before him. That means all of her false deities, all of her idols are washed away. And that really was Israel's Achilles heel for a good 2,000 years, even into the diaspora, where she would, and us being so far removed, we're not always aware of it, but people used to worship 30 deities. I would say even within Catholicism today, a lot of people, they go pray to this ancestor, or they go pray to that ancestor, or maybe they feel like they did something wrong and they've got to go intercede to this saint or that's, so there's a lot of this going on, but not so much in the Protestant movements. So there's been a lot of refining. So you find that the heart and the spirit, that is the first step. But then there is a physical step where, and it's mentioned something like between 8 times between Isaiah 40 and Isaiah 66, especially Isaiah 35, where he talks about the desert will bloom again, and how God will create a highway whereby he will physically deliver in a second Exodus, the outcasts of Judah and Ephraim from all lands. So there's this idea that all lands, it doesn't matter if it's Australia, if it's New Zealand, China, no matter where you are, God is going to provide a physical highway whereby people will be brought back to them. If it's in their heart to come, that access will be there. And it's so much like the first Exodus, because tied to this, he says, first of all, this is Isaiah 52:6. He says, you will know my name. So that's part of it. But there's also this tied to it, is that it will make his name great. It will make his fame go abroad across the face of the earth when this Exodus occurs. And he also says, unlike the first Exodus, you won't go out in haste, you won't go out in flight. It will be something that you can do. It will be accessible to you. But I have a feeling that with kind of what we're seeing in the world today, there will be enough oppressive things on the home front with our own political systems that we're going to say, I'm ready to go. Let's get out of Dodge. And so Ephraim, Ezekiel talks about taking the stick of Judah and the stick of Ephraim and making them one in his hand. Zion and Jerusalem are established first. That is the first step. So the establishment of the state of Israel in 1948, that actually is the first step to this latter day restoration. The second step is this miraculous, we talk about, even with the first Exodus, did they walk through just a little puddle, or, was there some, walls of water on the sides where Israel walked through? And it's the same question for the second Exodus, because what you see is this promise that Yahweh will again make a divine, miraculous deliverance, that separates him from all these competing gods and competing ideas of God.
Mm. And do you see any evidence that God would use kings once again? Would there be a David royal family line once again, or maybe a Messiah sort of figure in that?
You find in, especially, Jeremiah 31, Jeremiah 33, there's the promise where he states, if the sun and moon should ever cease before me, only then will I not take from the descendants of Levi or the descendants of David and not make them rulers before me. So yeah, those households will once again have leadership capacity. One of the things that I showed in my book is that Israel was actually very much a republic. You had a lot of representative government. So there's a lot of representative government even within those ruling houses being, tied to the land and tied to the leadership.
Yeah, yes. Just going to check through my list of questions. I believe I've got through most of them. Yes, I have. I would love to ask, if it's okay, just sort of your background. So you went on was it a 16-year pilgrimage to Israel? Was that right?
Yes. So around 1999, I came across a lot of beliefs, challenges to my faith that really questioned whether or not there was a God. And even more importantly for me was whether that God was righteous, because you can have a God, and being around some religious movements, their idea of God, I want no part of, because they make him an arbitrary tyrant who, as I understand it, would be a God of iniquity. What I discovered is that for God to be righteous, for any of us to be righteous, you have to actually live by your own law. So that means you don't oppress people unduly, you don't commit murder. I mean, just all of those basic, simple ideals God has to live by. And so it was quite a number of years, the dating of the Exodus kind of came into play with that, because one of the challenges that atheists have, as I mentioned before, is this idea that there is no evidence for an Exodus. Therefore, there was no Israel, there was no God, this is just folklore. So when I went back, because my Exodus date is right around 1550 BCE, when you go back to that early date and to Averroes and to everything that occurred in Egypt, all the evidence was there, even evidence perhaps for the death of the firstborn. But certainly there is evidence for the infants. When the infants were supposed to be thrown into the river and all of that. You have in many cities, in at least 4 cities that I looked at, this unusual high statistic of infant burials compared to the rest of the population. So everything that is there in the biblical narrative is there. You can find it in the ground. You can see it. So that for me, the more I dug, the more I wanted to learn, the more I wanted to know. But more than that, I just have a heart, a love, and a thirst for truth. And so, yeah, it took a good 16 years of in-depth study. And that was my first book, Yahweh Exists. And now I'm working on the second volume, because that's for the first volume. The second volume is going to be the Yahweh Exists Volume 2. But the first book, I'm dividing it into 5 books. The first book is The Suffering Servant. And that gets really, really good. I've mentioned Isaiah 52 a lot. And one of the reasons is because Isaiah 52 is key to Isaiah 53. So it's going to.
And I noticed in your book, you managed to find evidence that the Sumerian creation account and the Epic of Gilgamesh was taken from Genesis rather than the other way around, which was really interesting.
Yeah, and this is where in scholarship you have a lot of debates among scholars, because a lot of the words that are used are very, very similar. We call them cognates because it's how does this word in this language appear over here in this language. So that right there gives a lot of scholars consternation because of the similarity. So the question is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And what I find is that Torah, this is something that is very, very logical. It's very scientific. And there's a great book also I highly recommend by Gerald Schroeder. It's called Genesis and the Big Bang.
Mm.
And he goes through and he shows the science of it. So when you go through Genesis, you look at it scientifically, it's like, okay, this is what happened. So the only conclusion, if this is fact, then the only conclusion that you can walk away with is that the Assyrians, the Babylonians took that and made it fun. And in some regards, look at what we're doing today with the whole Avengers series and, whether it's Thor or Iron Man. I mean, it's kind of human nature. It's like, okay, here's the reality. Here's what happened, but oh, that's kind of boring. Let's liven this up a little bit. And so they did.
Yeah. And so did you write your book sort of literally as you were studying, or did you do maybe all the investigating and write it in one go? Does that make sense?
No. So it was rewritten probably 20 times.
Wow.
Definitely, as I studied, I came across new scholarship. And sometimes, too, it was the matter of new excavations or new articles being published. I'm just always out there looking for, and it's not, you have to be careful with that because you can get into confirmation bias. But what I have found in, doing this for 16 years now is that not one archaeological discovery, not one textual study contradicts anything that is written as far as the history of the Bible, as far as, even the beliefs, the theology. It's just there. And when it's truth, it stands up to questioning. It stands up to everything that you throw at it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jodelll. It's been an honor to meet you, and really thank you for your time as well. And it's been, a lot that I can take away. So, it's been great to meet you.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Dale, and thank you so much for having me. And I've enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you, and have a great day. Is it the afternoon over there with you? Is it?
Yeah, it's a dreary, rainy afternoon.
Yeah, we've been having quite a lot of snow over here at the moment, so it's quite cold at the moment. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jodelll. Have a great day.
You as well. Bye-bye.